So I made a video a while ago about how to use ISO that I would recommend watching either before or after this video. Regardless, I'll have it pop up somewhere on the screen. I'm going to be talking about some similar stuff from that video, but what I specifically want to touch on are the Sony cameras that use Cine EI as their exposure method. With Sony Cine EI, as you change the ISO value on your camera, it basically remaps the dynamic range in relation to middle gray. For instance, the Sony Venice 2 has 16 stops of dynamic range. At the camera's base ISO of 800, the camera has 6 stops of latitude in the highlights and 10 stops of latitude in the shadows. And that can be seen right here with this chart that Sony published for the Venice 2. Notice how at the lowest ISO value of 160, the camera has 4 stops of latitude in the highlights and now 12 stops in the shadows. At the highest value of 3200, the camera has 8 stops of latitude in the highlights and 8 in the shadows. With each increase or decrease of the ISO, we are losing or gaining a third of a stop in retention. This shows us that the lower your ISO, the more dynamic range you have into the shadows. The higher your ISO, the more dynamic range you have into the highlights. This is why you'll often see DPs setting their cameras to 1280 or 1600 ISO when they're shooting bright sunny exteriors, because it allows them to retain more information in, say, the bright sunny sky. It's also why when filming a moody, dark night exterior, you'll see DPs lower their ISO because it'll allow the camera to reach deeper into those shadows, leading to a much cleaner image. Now, I'm sure for some of you watching this right now, this probably sounds a little confusing because it's a bit backwards from what you would naturally want to do. You've probably been told that if you're in a bright location, you should lower your ISO, and if you're in a dark location, you should raise your ISO. And you could absolutely do that, but based on what we just learned, if you were to be shooting a dark night scene, raising your ISO might actually hurt you a little bit because now your camera isn't going to be able to see as deeply into those shadows, and you might get a much noisier image. Now, the other question you might be asking yourself is, okay, if I'm shooting a night scene and I drop my ISO down to 160 to gain an extra 2 stops in the shadows, my image is going to be overall much darker. So now I need more lighting. So is it really worth it for me to drop my ISO down to gain extra stops in the low end if I'm going to need more lighting? That question right there is exactly why I wanted to talk about Sony's dual base ISO. But before we do that, a quick word from our sponsor. Skillshare is an online learning community where you can take classes in just about anything you can think of, and I quite literally mean that. They have everything from how to use Blender to the art of crocheting to interior design. If it's a skill, someone has a class for it. And it's important to note that all of these classes are taught by world-class professionals and creatives, so whatever it is you choose to pick up, you're in good hands. I mean, they can't just let anybody teach classes. Otherwise, you'd end up with, I don't know, me teaching a class. And that would be bad because I literally don't know anything. I actually know so little that I've been taking classes of my own. I actually recently finished a class called Music Theory for Songwriters taught by Mike Barnes, and I don't want to brag, but I'm basically a master music producer now. Don't believe me? Check it out. Hear that, Mike?
I learned it by watching you.
Look, it's never a bad time to diversify yourself. Learning a new skill is always a positive, especially if you currently work in the film industry. In that case, I think we would all benefit from learning something new. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, go ahead and click that link in my description below. The first 500 people to use my QR code or my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Thank you again to Skillshare, and back to the video. When it comes to dual base ISOs, I feel they are often overlooked as just a simple means to make do in super low lit conditions. While that is an obvious benefit, there is a lot more utility that I think tends to go overlooked that I think once you understand it, highlights what exactly makes this feature so incredibly versatile. Let's go back to the Venice 2. The Sony Venice 2 has 2 base ISO options, 800 and 3200. Here's that dynamic range chart from earlier for the base ISO of 800, and here's their chart for the base ISO of 3200. You'll notice that the distribution in terms of dynamic range is the exact same between the two. The base ISO of 3200 has 6 stops of latitude in the highlights and 10 in the shadows. As we jump down to the lowest ISO value of 800, we have 4 stops in the highlights and 12 in the shadows. And when we jump up to our highest ISO value of 12,800, we have 8 in the highlights and 8 in the shadows, just like before. Once again, with each increase or decrease of the ISO value, we are losing or gaining a third of a stop in retention. The camera behaves the exact same way as it does at the base ISO of 800. Now, to see why this is so useful, let's go back to our earlier night scenario. Let's say we're shooting a fairly dark scene and we want to save as much information in the shadows as possible. So we drop our ISO down from 800 to 160 so we can get those extra 2 stops. We've now lowered the overall exposure for this image by 2 1/3 stops, so it's too dark. And let's say in this scenario, we don't have any lighting, so we can't fix it by adding more light. What we can now do in this scenario, since our camera has this dual base ISO functionality, is we can swap over from the 800 base setting to the 3200 base setting, and then from there, drop our ISO down to 800. What this is going to end up doing for us is giving us the exact same exposure that we had earlier when we were at the base ISO setting of 800, but now on top of that, we're going to have that extra 2 stops of range in the shadows. And sure, dropping down to 800 from the 3200 base isn't going to be as clean as if we drop down to 160 from the 800 base, but it is going to be cleaner than the 800 base in this scenario because we have those extra 2 stops of range. I know this is a lot of technical stuff and a lot of numbers, but does that make sense? This is something that I don't see enough people talk about online that I think they should talk about, because I think it's a great example of how you can actually utilize the dual base ISO functionality to your advantage in a real world scenario. Too often I see the dual base ISO functionality being boiled down to a means to take advantage of street lights or practical lamps or whatever other dim ambient light source there is. And while that is absolutely a way that you can use it, it isn't the only way to use it. I think it is incredibly important to have a really good understanding of your camera's sensor, how it behaves, how the dynamic range fluctuates. Knowing these things is what helps you to make the right decisions on set so that you can get the images that you want or the images that you need. In that lighting scenario that we just talked about, a lot of people might just stay at that base ISO setting of 800 because they don't realize that if you were to jump up to 3200 and then bring it back down, you're going to gain that extra information in the shadows. They may just say, well, it's the same ISO, what's the point? Completely overlooking the effect that it has on your camera's dynamic range. And what I'm talking about is true for all Sony cinema cameras that use Cine EI, not just the Venice 2. So we're talking the FX3, the FX6, the Burano. The only real difference is going to be the actual ISO values. Let's take a look at the FX3, which is a camera that a lot more people have compared to the Sony Venice. The FX3 has 2 base ISO options, 800 and 12,800. At both 800 and 12,800, you're going to have about 6 stops in the highlights and 9 stops in the shadows. Once again, each incremental change of the ISO is going to give or take 1/3 of a stop. At your lowest ISO value, you're going to have about 4 stops in the highlights and 11 in the shadows, and at the highest ISO value, you're going to have 8 stops in the highlights and 7 in the shadows. With the FX3, from the second base ISO option of 12,800, your lowest ISO option is going to be 3,200 and your highest value is going to be 51,200, which is a ridiculous number. Let's one more time go back to that earlier night scenario, but now instead of using a Venice 2, we're using an FX3. We have the camera set to its base ISO of 800. Once again, we want more information in the shadows, so we drop our ISO down to 200, same as before, the image is too dark and we don't have any lighting. Since we're using the FX3, we can now switch ourselves to the second base ISO option of 12,800 and then drop it down to 3,200 ISO. Now, the reason why this is interesting and especially useful for low-budget filmmakers is because now not only are we getting those extra 2 stops of range in the shadows, we're also gaining a whole 2 stops of overall exposure in the image because every doubling of the ISO is 1 stop. We've gone from 800 ISO to now 3,200, which is useful in this scenario because we're now able to do a lot more with a lot less. On top of that, our image is going to be cleaner at 3,200 as opposed to the base ISO setting of 800 because of those extra stops in the shadows. And if you look at the way that the ISO values are set on the FX3, when you're at your base ISO setting of 800, 3,200 is your highest option. And when you're at your base setting of 12,800, 3,200 is your lowest option. If we reference the way that the dynamic range scales on the chart, when we're at our base setting of 800, 3,200 is going to give us about 8 stops in the highlights and 7 stops in the shadows. When we're at our base option of 12,800, that same 3,200 is going to give us 4 stops in the highlights and then 11 stops in the shadows. Same ISO values, but a drastically different mapping in terms of dynamic range. I mean, we're looking at a 4 stop difference in terms of the shadows. And this is kind of what makes the FX3 such an excellent camera when it comes to low light or night shooting, but that also brings me to one of my issues. A lot of people will take cameras like the FX3 or the FX6 and just switch it over to 12,800 just as a way to make do with having no lighting. And since 12,800 is such a high exposure value, much more so than people need most of the time, a lot of the times people will use ND to bring the image back down to a reasonable exposure. It may actually be more beneficial to drop your ISO down as opposed to using ND to bring it down because, I mean, let's be honest, if you're jumping up to 12,800, chances are you're in a dark environment. If that's the case, then the extra range in the shadows is going to be way more useful. And let's be honest, 3200 ISO, that is plenty for majority of things. I'm sure there are a lot of you watching right now that already understand this completely, but I've had a lot of conversations recently with people where I've been met with, "Oh, I didn't realize that you could really do that." So I just felt like I had to make a video on it. Go do some tests, try it out. Like I said earlier, it's really important to understand your camera sensor so that you can pretty much do whatever it is that you want to do. Anyway, that's all for this video. I'll see you later. Bye.